Well, hello, and a very warm welcome to that Friday feeling. It's me, Andrew Eborn here, and welcome indeed to the Muckrakers, the show where we devour the meatiest of topics as we strip the carcass of current affairs down to its bare bones and focus on the stories that matter to you, wherever you're listening or watching from around the world. Today, we're going to discuss the West's involvement in the conflict in Ukraine, the increased recognition around the world of a Palestinian state. And as the UK heads towards a general election, really, does the rest of the world care who is in number 10? And I want to hear from you. You can get in touch, and this is how you can do it.
Our lines are open. From the U.S. and Canada, call 1-888-201-6425. From the U.K., call 033-0024-1026. And from Australia and New Zealand, call 1-800-670-310. Free speech is alive and well on today's News Talk, TNT Radio.
Free speech is indeed alive and well, and we want you to take part. People always grizzle that there's no opportunity to let their voices be heard. Well, there is. This is the show where you can do it. Phone the Muckrakers. There's no excuse. Doesn't matter about the chat. What does, you can chat amongst yourselves. If you want your voice to be heard, phone in the show. And if you've got any thoughts on the topics, I would love to hear about you. And you can even raise something different if you really want to. Well, today's Muckrakers, to finish the week on a high, it's made up of me, Andrew Eborn, but two titans of political thinking. We've got Alex Krainer all the way over in Croatia, and my good mate, I did threaten to bring him on the inaugural week, my good mate, Lembit Opik. Let's start with you, Alex. You're in Croatia. If I recognise the scene right, it looks a bit like Opatia. Is that right?
Yeah, correct.
See, I can tell the scenery from here. And Lembit, you've just been working super hard. I know. We thought we'd drag you out a little bit further, which is interesting. So welcome indeed, both of you, to the show. Now, let's start. Dominic Cummings, my old mate. Boris Johnson's former advisor, he's launched an attack on Western support for Ukraine, declaring that the West should never have gone into the whole stupid situation. I'm sure there was an expletive there somewhere they missed out. And claiming sanctions against Russia have had a greater impact on European politics than in Moscow. He went on to say that corrupt Ukrainian mafia state has conned us all. So does the West really have any business being involved in Ukraine? Emotive topics. I want to hear your views as well. But let's start with you, though, Alex. Is the West destroying itself in Ukraine?
Well, there's no question about it. They're obviously destroying themselves in the West, in Ukraine. And this is not exactly news. Already in 2014, Barack Obama had better advisors who told him that in Ukraine, Russia had escalatory dominance, and that term means something. So Obama was extremely reluctant and declined to get involved militarily, which proved to be a very good idea. How did we get to this point where after 8 years of preparations of both sides, the West decided to get involved in Ukraine after all? Well, it was achieved, I think, by cultivating groupthink. And we have at least one concrete example of this. You might recall that in January of 2022, the admiral of the German Navy, his name is Kai Akim Schonbach. He was at some military defense summit in India, where he blundered into saying that the low-cost solution to the crisis in Ukraine would be to acknowledge Russia's security concerns in the region and to deal with Russia as a peer and treat them with respect, something to that effect. And that statement ended this admiral's military career. He was out that same day. And, you know, the hierarchy does not suffer reasonable people. And people who were gung-ho for war were promoted. You know, good example, Victoria Nuland. So she's been a permanent fixture in a foreign policy circle in Washington, D.C. She loves war. She's always eager for somebody else's children to be sacrificed for some military misadventure. And this is how we got where we are. Obviously, it's been a terrible blunder, but, you know, there are circles in our ruling establishment that don't care. They they win every time the whole nation loses.
Interesting. Lembit, I'm sure you have a view. Is the West destroying itself in Ukraine?
Yeah. Do you want more?
No, that's enough. Thank you very much for calling, Lembit, and on the calls.
No,
we
how
want to hear
dare
your
you?
views. Go on, Lembit, go for it.
How dare you? I certainly agree with my colleague. Fundamentally, there are three things you need to remember. First of all, we saw this coming. The Russians and Putin felt enormously provoked by the West. And I totally agree with what you've just been saying, Alex. They could see that the West was being predatory and breaking its promises to Russia about the status of Ukraine. So that's the first thing. And second thing is that Putin pretty much warned everybody about what he was going to do. It didn't come as a big surprise to many of us that he decided to intervene. And then the third and the final point, even if you disagree with the first two, it's an unwinnable war for the West. The supply lines are 50 kilometers for the Russians and 5,000 kilometers for the West. Now, on top of that, there's another problem. This was meant to be a short, sharp victory over Russia. They were meant to be repelled because they were some useless army that could be defeated. But of course, they're not a useless army, and they have tremendous firepower. And the West's getting bored because it wasn't the win that America and the UK and the others wanted. So now they've backed off. Now, Alex made a really interesting point about the German naval man. I tried to explain that there was another side to the story, and I nearly got fired from a job because they said, well, we don't really feel very comfortable about your position about being pro-Russia. It's not about being pro-Russia. It's about being pro-common sense. That's the thing that's missing.
Which was that job, Lembit? Which was that job?
I don't want to get fired from it, so I'm not going to tell you what it is. It wasn't a
it's one you still got. Okay.
It wasn't a broadcasting job. It was just a job in a basically a business. And they said, oh, we don't think that we want any pro-Russians here. I said, hang on, I'm actually pro-peace. I'm pointing out that sooner or later we're going to have to sue for peace anyway because we can't win it. And here's the stupid thing. We are in the position that we put Russia in Afghanistan when when they lost there. How can we forget the fact that the Russians are in exactly the winning position that we caused against them in the past? This is an insane situation where politicians think they know better than the military, and we're not going to win because there's a sense of impossibility about it. Even if you thought we should win, we can't because we haven't got the logistics on our side.
No, and you make a very interesting point, because when people want to speak out, it's not about being pro one side or the other. Pro peace is what people want. And I always say we should shine more light and less heat on the topics. But the threats for people being fired from their jobs is abhorrent, isn't it? I mean, you working on that sort of thing. Yeah.
I find it disappointing because it's a kind of censorship. And it wasn't, people could disagree with my position, and viewers can disagree now at today's news talk. We're here about free speech. But what we actually do in the West is we assume that anybody who takes the contrarian view is wrong. That's essentially what's happening in other wars, and we'll talk about them later. So fundamentally, I could summarize my position here. We helped Zelensky have a war which we can extend, but we cannot win. All Putin has to do is wait till democracies get bored and finish the job, and then we'll be at the negotiating table 300,000 deaths later anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Bored or bankrupt, or both, probably. But so do you think that's right then, Alex? Do you think we've been dragged into, the West has been dragged into an unwinnable war?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I think that what Lembit just explained is exactly what I suggested. It's as though certain circles in the West have been cultivating a groupthink that just cannot stand any contrarian view. And so even if you're reasonable, even if you're pro-peace, even if you're trying to be constructive, it's always perceived as you're being Vladimir Putin's useful idiot, and therefore you cannot be on the inside, and the insiders make the decisions. And so the insiders were gung-ho on using Ukraine to destroy Russia. They had their agenda set out, and they were going to go through with it one way or the other. It didn't work out, so they'll open other fronts. They will try to provoke conflicts elsewhere, but they will not give up. And so they will keep dragging us into. They are coming to the end of the war in which they intended to fight to the last Ukrainian. And I'm very concerned that next they will try to fight it to the last Pole and last Estonian and last German and last French and so forth. And so the juggernaut will not stop. They will continue. And so I think that we have to continue to speak out, because this message is percolating slowly, and they are flipping out about it. Just what was it? Just about 2-3 weeks ago, it was on the 7th May that the CEO of Palantir said that if they lose the intellectual battle, well, he was referring to Israel, but it's related. That if they lose the intellectual battle over this, that the West will not be able to field any armies anywhere at all. Something, not the exact quote, but this is, and they're extremely vexed about it. So I think that all we have to do is keep on doing what we are doing right here, right now.
Yeah, it isn't. So why do you think then the UK government's assumed such a prominent role in the Ukraine war, Lembit?
Votes in Britain. The whole thing about this and the flip-flopping about Gaza, which I know we'll come to later, it's all about working on the optics to the British public. And so that's why you had Boris Johnson flying over to Ukraine and back, and you had Liz Truss doing it, because they want to be war heroes. They all remember the fact that Margaret Thatcher, a former Prime Minister in the UK, was heading for a catastrophic defeat around 1982. And then she had a war with Argentina, which she ostensibly won. And then she had a huge majority in 83. That's what's going on. The second reason is because they're superficial thinkers. Now, one of the horrendous things in this country is we've hollowed out the intelligentsia from our political system, and we've just got people who just want to be politicians rather than people with a narrative. And so they think, oh, we'll have a war over there, we'll throw the money in there, and then we'll be victorious. They ignore the fact that because of our work, billions have been spent there. As you've said, Alex, lots of Ukrainians and Russians have been killed, but not British people, because we don't like to get our hands dirty like that. And the biggest irony of all, the Russian economy is set to grow faster than the British one. So none of it's really made any difference to Russia. It's an inconvenience because you've got a lot of military stuff going on there. But it's about the optics in this country. And I think the same is in America.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm always reminded of that movie Wag the Dog. You remember when they wanted to avoid a political scandal? There was a sex scandal. It was very, very close to home. They had Dustin Hoffman in it and various others. Brilliant stuff. And they basically invented a war so the people would focus on that. It was the basic principle. I think it was working on the principle that if you sort of throw a dead cat on the table or something, they're only going to talk about the dead cat. Well, a war unites people, doesn't it? And I think that's what's going to happen. But I'm not sure the general public are behind it in that sort of way. Do you think they are? What do you think, Alex?
No, I don't think. Sorry.
Oh, go for it. I reckon that Lembit does. And what do you think, Alex? Do you think the public are behind the war?
It's no, not at all. And in fact, this is a major problem for them, because when the whole thing started in February 2022, they really wanted to galvanize the Western public for a general all of NATO war against Russia. It didn't work out. The public opinion already then, within days, within 2 weeks from the beginning of the special military operation, was already not quite supportive of Western intervention. So I remember that there was a French poll in February of 2022, so literally about 2 weeks after the start of the war, and it turned out that 56% of the French public actually sympathized with Russian position. They basically turned out that they believed Russian rationales for the intervention. I have a friend who works for NATO in one of the NATO member countries in Europe, and she told me that NATO is keenly monitoring public opinion in member states. And that even back then in 2022, in the former Warsaw Pact countries, so, generally Eastern Europe, Romania, Bulgaria, Czech Republic, and so forth, that about 3/4 of the public sympathized with the Russian positions. And that in countries like France, Spain, Italy, Belgium, that about 2/3 of the public sympathized with the Russian position. And then we also
so you talk. So just before moving on, just so everybody's very, very clear on this, you say the Russian position. How would you summarize that? Because it started off as it's just a little military exercise, and obviously it's escalated. Just to clarify for everybody, what is the Russian position?
Russian position is that Ukraine cannot be a member of NATO. It cannot be a NATO member country. That it had to be commit to being neutral, like Finland used to be, and commit not to become a member of NATO. So,
but it's a bit wider than that. It's a bit wider than that, isn't it? It's not just not becoming a member. They want it to be back within. Russia wants to own it, doesn't it?
No, that's not correct to characterize it this way. There was a very significant conflict between Russia, Ukraine staying in the Russian orbit or Ukraine joining the EU. However, the issue has been way oversimplified in the West, thinking as if this were like two mutually exclusive civilizational choice. Basically, the deal that the EU was offering to Ukraine back in 2013, which is what triggered, what catalyzed the whole conflict that led to the coup, would have cost Ukraine $160 billion US. Okay, the transition because Ukraine's economy would have to fully transition to European standards, which would have lost Ukraine the export markets to Russia, and practically all of the finished goods that Ukraine was producing were being absorbed by Russia. So the European side, what Vladimir Putin was saying is, we can do the agreement tripartite, three sides, so that Ukraine can remain as a trading partner to Russia and gradually pivot to the EU, and no objection to Ukraine joining the EU. The Europeans categorically refused that, and we have Emmanuel Barroso on record saying that there's no choice here. It's either one or the other. So this was refused. And then the $160 billion bill for Ukraine to make this transition, nobody was offering to fund it, and Ukraine didn't have the money to fund it. And so, there came a point when Yanukovych was meant to sign it. And he said, I can't sign it. We don't have the money. This deal doesn't work. And that's when the whole conflict started, ended up 2 months later in a coup. But it wasn't
so it's not about energy, it's not about territory, it's just about making sure they don't join the UN. Do you buy that, Lembit?
Yes, I think that Alex correctly talks about the agenda that you don't hear in the mainstream media, because you're not allowed to argue that Vladimir Putin could possibly ever have any possible claim that we might not be doing something right. NATO has become a desperately territorial predator. I go to Bulgaria very often, and I can tell you that what Alex says is right. Something like 3/4 of the public and a fairly large proportion of their parliament is sympathetic to Russia for historical reasons, and they're pragmatists. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the Baltic countries, have been pushed into becoming a little bit more belligerent. Finland and Sweden, I think, made a bad mistake by deneutralizing themselves. What does NATO want? It basically wants to surround Russia, and it loves the idea of having a choking ring around it. And why? Because they are expansionist. Anybody who doesn't think that needs to look at the history of American behavior across the last 100 years. Some things they've done which were very important. Other things have been entirely self-serving. So if I was to add one thing to what Alex said, it would be this. We all know there has to be a negotiated settlement anyway. But as long as we make unreasonable demands on Putin, which contradict previous promises to Putin, we're going to be in a stalemate, and the bodies will build up on both sides.
Interesting stuff, and thank you. This is where we do have the home of free speech. We do want to shine a spotlight on these issues. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to be talking about the US concerned, basically about Israel's isolation on the world stage. You're watching the Muckrakers. We'll be back after these messages.
And one is wondering: is there an agenda? Are they planning to ramp up this war over the summer ahead of the 2024 elections in the U.S. to kind of lock in a U.S. position for Joe Biden on this? Is this what's happening? Certainly looks like it. And this is happening while Ukraine is losing and losing big time. Russia's mounting a counteroffensive in Kharkiv in the northeast of the country. That's a ostensibly Russian-speaking area. Very important enclave, though, for NATO. If they lose that, Ukraine's second biggest city by population, well, then if they do, it won't be Ukraine for very long. Let's put it that way.
Patrick Henningsen on today's News Talk, TNT. Critically analyzing global affairs. The Muckrakers on today's News Talk, TNT.
Welcome back. It's Andrew Eborn here. You are watching the Muckrakers and my glorious panel with Alex and Lembit. Fascinating stuff. The phone lines are going crazy. You have your chance to have your voice heard. Do ring in. In the meantime, the US is concerned about Israel's growing diplomatic isolation amongst countries that have traditionally supported it. Joe Biden's national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, said this week, and this came following news that Ireland, Spain, and Norway will next week formally recognize a Palestinian state. So, should a Palestinian state be recognized? What do you think, Alex?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, why not? What would be the reason not to recognize them?
It's fairly clear, isn't it? I think that everybody's talking about a two-state solution. What do you think, Lembit?
Well, there's a clue in the phrase. Two-state solution.
Exactly.
America proposed it. Israel was not happy with it, but probably would have taken it if the money bung was big enough from the States. And so when you talk about a two-state solution, which was clearly the best thing to do, it's insane that we now pretend that a two-state solution could be considered to be a one-state solution. The other point here, which is interesting, is this. If we look at what's happening, I saw somebody on the mainstream media, a government minister in the United Kingdom, saying, oh, well, with this war crimes thing, it doesn't make any sense because Hamas doesn't represent a state. Double problem here. Number one, therefore, Britain should recognize the war crimes accusation against the state of Israel. And number two, it's our own choice. It's not like someone's telling us not to identify Palestine as a state. And just think about the converse. If we don't recognize Palestine as a state, what are we saying? We've caused this mess in the first place for noble reasons in the 1940s, but we've caused it. And it's our responsibility to place the displaced people that we shoved out of the way to try to make good some terrible things that happened in World War II. We've got to give them the space. What's the alternative? Just keep wandering and let's have this perpetual war as Israel tries in vain to kill people before they've even become Hamas activists.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think people on that sort of basis, the world is sort of turning around and saying this. If people do have a contrary view, get on and explain it to us because we're here to listen. But what do you think the implications are, though, from the announcement from Spain, Ireland and Norway? Is the rest of the world going to follow?
Yes,
let's start with you, Alex. Oh, sorry. Go for it, Alex.
I think that the rest of the world will follow. This is probably the start. I think it's a process that's irreversible. And I think that ultimately Israel is going to suffer for the blunder that they have done over the last 230 days or so. And it is becoming isolated. But, it's not just a problem for Israel. It's a problem for the whole Western world, because I have to say, I lived my whole life thinking that, Israel was created for the right reason with noble intent and all of this. I now have serious doubts about this because, all those pronouncements from the U.S. Defense establishment and foreign policy establishment that regarded Israel as their unsinkable aircraft carrier. The more I see of this crisis, the more I think that this is in fact what the agenda was, creating a beachhead into the Middle East. And now that the beachhead is proving ineffective, you can already see the United States kind of getting ready to throw Israel overboard. They're negotiating a truce behind Israel's back in Egypt. They are negotiating with the Turks. The special relationship there between Israel and United States is starting to show cracks. And I think that the moral case didn't change, but the geostrategic case did change. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I always cut you off when you start. I would bounce off to Alex. So what were you going to say?
It doesn't matter now. Speak to the hand. No, I'm joking. No, I declare war on you, Eborn.
We did that
I'm going to join
time,
NATO now.
Absolutely.
Well, only because I know Alex is going to steal my thunder because he's so good at this. I just, rather than repeating what Alex is saying, it does a very simple thing here. The big picture is that a little bit like what we were talking in regard to the Ukraine situation, America has just automatically assumed it needs to back Biden and that Hamas were the terrorists. Now, I went to a very interesting talk, actually for TNT, today's news talk, last October, where a Palestinian representative said, blame depends on where you draw the starting point. On the 7th October, if that's the starting point, then you can blame Hamas. If you go back to the 1940s, it's far more complicated. And if you add the death tolls, it's far more complicated. And so therefore, in the intricacies of the situation, it's perfectly obvious that Palestine has been oppressed by orders of magnitude more than anything that's happened to Israel across that 80-year period. And this was some kind of a reaction. Now, we can talk about the rights and wrongs, or the wrongs of what happened on 7th October, where innocents were killed. But actually, Israel's done an incredible thing. They've drawn public relations defeat from the jaws of victory. After the 7th of October, a lot of people were tremendously sympathetic to Israel. But after the initial killing there, over 32,000 civilians have been killed. Now think about this. 1.5% of the entire population of Gaza has been killed by Israel's response. And the public, which generally didn't even know where Palestine was before this, is reasonable and says, no, this isn't right. We recognize something terrible is happening here. And on top of that, Americans are saying to Biden, to Benjamin Netanyahu, cool it. And he said, well, no, I'm just going to carry on regardless. It's like, and the way he thinks he can sweep up and down through Gaza and kill all the Hamas terrorists, it's like trying to part water with your hands because he's creating militancy. I grew up in Northern Ireland. This is what happened. It creates militancy. If your family's been wiped out by the actions of Israel, it's hardly surprising that you're going to get more militants. You're
absolutely right. And
situation.
You work on that sort of basis. You're going to build people who will be militant. If you see the slaughter of innocent children and things like that, that will go on for generations. So do you think, Alex, that it's a genocide or a reasonable retaliation for October the 7th?
No, absolutely not. And I think that Israel is committing suicide. I mean, let's not forget, it was in 2012 that Henry Kissinger himself said, 10 years from now, there will be no more Israel. So it's been more than 10 years, but he knew what he was talking about. And I think that we are at that point of history where there is no easy ways out, and nobody's giving up. They're doubling down, they're quadrupling down, they're quintupling down on a violent response. Israeli military themselves know that A, they cannot defeat Hamas. B, if they take on Hezbollah in the north, it's the end of IDF. They themselves have written military policy papers saying that taking on Hezbollah in the north would be absolutely suicidal against IDF. And then there's still Syria and Iran. So, at this point, any reasonable person would think like, we have to make nice with our neighbors. We have to change policy. We have to change strategy. Instead, these people are in some kind of an eschatological mindset, and they're ready to sacrifice themselves, their families, their whole country, everything, for exclusively one agenda, and nothing else. Nothing else counts. So that to me is a suicidal drive, and I think it's going to end badly for Israel.
Yeah, and the real tragedy that we have is, but I think in the world we get desensitized to the statistics, the number of casualties, and so on and so forth. And behind each and every one of those numbers is a human life, and that's what I find tragic on both sides. And it is absolutely horrendous what's going on, and it needs to be investigated fully. Lembit, let me come to you. I mean, do you think the UK and the US should be more or less involved in Israel? What are your thoughts?
They should be. Oh, they should be very as involved as they are with Israel, but in a different way. Instead of simply feeding this insane, violent fire across Gaza, they should be saying, listen, Netanyahu, it's not anti-Semitic to think that you are making a terrible, terrible, murderous mistake here. We are going to sit down with you, and if you play nice, we'll play nice back. That's what we should be doing. So we shouldn't disengage from Israel, but we shouldn't simply be giving him the weapons. In terms of those statistics, think about it this way. When's the last time the United Kingdom, the United States, supported a nation that's killed somewhere between 1.5% and 2% of an entire nation state, recognized by 140 other countries, its population? That would be like France coming into Britain and killing 1.2 million people, at least. That would be like Mexico invading America and killing something like 5 million people. They wouldn't tolerate it. But we're actually on the side of the country that's doing it. And once again, to emphasize, the overwhelming majority of people who've been killed here have nothing to do with militancy. They're trying to live their lives, love their partners, eat. And they're the ones who are suffering. And that's why Benjamin Netanyahu is losing so much popularity.
Yeah, I mean, you make an excellent point on that one. And I think it goes back to what you were saying beforehand about whether it's pro-Russia or whether it's anti-Semitic. I mean, the reality is this. We're all pro-peace. And I think just putting a label on somebody just tries to devalue the argument, doesn't it, Alex?
Well, yeah, absolutely. We've gone off the trail. We've gone into uncharted territories, and this is going to leave a deep stain on the conscience of the humanity. And history will be harsh, but there are going to be changes from the current state of affairs that are going to change the face of the Middle East, and the whole affair will prove very, very counterproductive for the Western approach to the crisis.
Yeah, moving on then, as countries like Israel and Ukraine are ravaged by war, let's turn our attention to what happens afterwards. When the soldiers are gone, the guns fall silent, who picks up the pieces? Who's going to be responsible to rebuild these countries? What do you think, Lembit? Who should take responsibility for rebuilding war-struck countries?
Well, if they haven't got oil, then who cares? If they have got oil, it's us, because then we occupy. It's as simple as that. Yemen, a war which has been going on, a horrendous war, where just about the poorest country in the world has been the victim of bombing by one of the richest next door, Saudi Arabia. But no one really talks about it. Unless I mention it now, we probably wouldn't have mentioned it even on this show, on today's News Talk TNT. But they haven't got anything we need. On the other hand, Iraq's got plenty of oil. So we make up a reason, we invade, and then we start extracting it. As far as Gaza's concerned, their one hope is they apparently have some oil in the shallow seas just off the coast. So it might be that we'll put a few billion in there so that we can get our hands on it. The tragic truth is we cut and run. We did it in Vietnam. We did it in Afghanistan. We've sort of even done it in Iraq. And this is the problem. Once the dust settles, there isn't really anyone who's got a financial vested interest in rebuilding the place.
Yeah, and I think it's absolutely right. When you're looking at energy, you're looking at oil and what sort of the assets are. But do you think we've got a moral obligation, Alex, to help, given the part it's played in the conflicts, the West here? What do you think?
Well, I think we do, but that's something where I would agree with Lempik. It's we don't go by morals. We go by whether the area has money good collateral sitting there, and if it doesn't, we don't care. But I think that there's another problem here. I think that the West has lost its ability to project power in the region. Okay, and this is something that's very well understood by the West adversaries, because already since the 1990s, since the early 1990s, the Pentagon has had these reports and papers that pretty much laid out that there are two ways that the West maintains its hegemony over the Middle East. One is by relying on their allies, primarily Israel, and two is by projecting power, meaning you send these aircraft carrier strike groups. Both of those things went sour. Israel is weak. Saudis are no longer really an ally. Jordan is weak. All the alliances are coming apart at the seams. And the aircraft carrier strike groups have become instantly obsolete with the advent of hypersonic precision-guided missiles. They can be sunk to the bottom. And everybody in the region understands this. The Egyptians understand this, the Iranians understand this, the Syrians understand this. It's only a matter of time before the West gets completely squeezed from out of the Middle East, and there goes that collateral.
No, you're absolutely right. Well, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, does the world really care who the British Prime Minister is? You're watching Talk News, or today's News Talk even. It's TNT. We'll be back after these messages.
The Muckrakers are restless. This is today's News Talk, TNT.
We're restless indeed. It's Andrew Eborn here, the Muckrakers. I'm joined by wonderful Lembit and also Alex discussing the whole world and how to put it to rights. But I also want to hear from you, and here's how you can do it.
This is the way we're going to be heard.
From the U.S. and Canada, call 1-888-201-6425. From the U.K., call 033-0024-1026. And from Australia and New Zealand, call 1-800-670-310. Free speech is alive and well on today's News Talk, TNT Radio.
Indeed, free speech is alive and well, and you're part of it. Don't grizzle that you can't have your voice heard. You've got a place, you've got a voice. Ring those numbers now. Now, the UK Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, Prime Minister at least for a few more weeks, maybe 6, announced this week that a general election will take place on July the 4th. We've discussed it here on TNT, including during yesterday's Muckrakers, and it's been analysed around the world. But to what extent does the world really care who Britain's Prime Minister is and who is the power in the United Kingdom? Let's start with you, Alex. Do people care who the UK Prime Minister is?
On a scale of 1 to 10, I would say 0.
As high as that?
I would say it's about 0. I think that the world has become pretty much disinterested. The whole show of democracy in the UK has become embarrassing and painful to watch, because we see that the leaders are extremely low caliber and every next one is lower than the previous one. And I kind of feel bad for the British people, because I think they do deserve better leadership. I know many British people. I like them. They're really nice people, but their political class is really degenerate. I'm sorry to use that word, but that's how it comes across.
Yeah, I mean, you do make a very interesting point, and I talked about this earlier on the Muckrakers, is that the biggest winner in the local elections last time around was actually apathy. We had some people, 32% in some places, I think 22% turnout in others. People don't care, or what they're doing is having a negative vote. They say, well, we don't like the current lot, therefore we'll maybe vote for the others. It's not a positive vote saying these are the people who are going to make a difference. What do you think, Lembit?
Yes. At the moment, the two old parties, legacy parties, Conservatives and Labour, were famously described, my favourite phrase at the moment, by George Galloway, who's a rebel yell in Parliament, as described as two cheeks of the same political backside. And that's true. We've been sitting on the right cheek. That's got a bit numb. Now we'll be sitting on the left cheek. And here's the problem. Rishi Sunak runs the Conservatives and Keir Starmer runs the Labour Party, but they could swap parties and it would still make sense. On all the subjects that you, me and Alex have been discussing, the two main parties agree. They agree that they'll let Netanyahu carry on doing whatever he wants to do. They agree about throwing billions into the war in Ukraine. They agree on gender politics occupying a huge space in British politics. They basically agree on the economy. So there isn't really a choice. Now, back to the question you asked about world interest. I had Simon Spanswick, who's the chief of the Association of International Broadcasters, on my show this morning here on today's News Talk TNT. And he said, a little bit like what Alex said, they're watching, but in a slightly disinterested way. There's a famous phrase from the past when there was a headline, apocryphal probably, fog in the Channel, continent isolated. Well, I don't think that arrogance works anymore. I think that Britain has made its choice. And then with the big customers it could be working with, Russia, India, China, it turns its back. What's going to happen? Work it out for yourself. Do the maths.
No. Just to pick you up on one point, though, you said there's not a lot of difference. And this is interesting because what Rishi Sunak's saying is that we've got to continue. We've made progress. Timing of the announcement was interesting. I did predict it was going to be on July the 4th. And I also predicted that the headlines following the torrential rain that we've had, things could only get wetter. Well, I don't think they could get any wetter for him at all. Drowning out, terrible. But the reality was this. He's saying, and it's through fear, he's saying, look, we're making progress. They've just had one of his 5 pledges. Remember, one of them was about inflation, when inflation was over 11%. He got it that earlier that day to 2.3%, I think the announcement was. So there was a victory. So all of a sudden, people suddenly say, well, stick with us. We're making progress. So don't change is the thing. Keir Starmer's turning around and saying, we need a change. He's made it very clear, for example, on Rwanda, that he wouldn't have the Rwanda scheme. So he'd abolish that, and whatever people think of it, that would be the difference. So there are changes and slight differences in the party. But as I say, the difficulty is it's still a negative vote. You don't want to go with this one. You want to go with the other ones because they're not them, which is not a good way of doing it. But let me ask you this, though, is how does who's in number 10 affect our relationship with other Western countries? What do you think, Alex?
I think it doesn't really, because as Lambit pointed out, the policy doesn't change. It doesn't matter who's in number 10. The policy is always the same. So I think it doesn't make much difference at all. And maybe if oh gosh, I forget the former Labour leader who was the big
Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah, people won't forget him. He'll be very disappointed to hear that he's going to stand as an independent, is what he said this time.
No. Of course, I remember. It was a lapse.
Poor old Jeremy. He's a regular. He's already tweeted in saying, "Alex, who?" He said.
He wouldn't dare. He wouldn't dare.
I know it's got to be done.
But if Jeremy Corbyn was a candidate and he became prime minister, then I think that much of the world would warm up to the United Kingdom and maybe expect some real changes. Keir Starmer, everybody understands that he's only small degrees more or less corrupt than Rishi Sunak.
Interesting. What do you think, Lambert?
In Starmer's own words, he'd rather be in Davos than in Westminster. He'd rather be getting his instructions from Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum than listening to the parliament, which is meant to run this country. His words, not mine, paraphrase, but that was exactly the meaning. When a putative prime minister would rather take his marching orders from the unelected WEF than from the British electorate, you've got a problem. And when you listen to Keir Starmer, as Alex says, there's no substantive difference in foreign policy, whatever. Let's do a radical thought experiment at the risk of being fired from other work. Imagine if we had a candidate who said, we're actually going to call out Benjamin Netanyahu for killing 32,000 civilians. I'm going to fly there and I'm going to tell him we're not going to support him. We'll engage with him. We're not going to support him if we do that, if he carries on doing this. Imagine if that same person, Prime Minister, then flew to Russia and sat down with Putin and said, look, we've got a mess in Ukraine. Let's talk this through. And then imagine if he flew to China and said, we all know you're building everything that we're buying. How can we have a peaceful interaction without you spying on us too much? This is radical thinking. But to me, this is common sense. And that's why George Galloway, that rebel I mentioned before, won in the by-election, because he said that kind of thing. And the establishment hated it. In fact, we had a panic-ridden statement the next day from Rishi Sunak. And one of the people who's mentioned in all of that debate was a chap called Nick Griffin as a great threat to democracy. Griffin did my news review this morning. He wasn't a great threat to democracy. He's just a thinking man. And this is the point. This is the problem. This is the alliance that we've got between those two. The uni party offers no options, which is why the small parties are beginning to do so well.
Well, and it is interesting because it was Edward Bernays, the father of PR, who said that the biggest human emotion, the most persuasive human emotion is fear. So this is what Rishi's peddling. He's saying fear of change, we're making progress. So if you change, you're going to lose. And we're going to lose all that progress that we're making. Interesting thing on fear, and I don't know if you saw this, it doesn't seem to be very widely reported, is they say Britain should have 3 days worth of tinned food and water. Did you see this? There's a new website which has been launched and it's just been announced. Deputy Prime Minister Oliver Dowden revealed in this new website, they're basically advising people to protect themselves from various risks, including biosecurity crisis, flooding, power outages, and another pandemic. Did you see this report? Lembit, let's start with you because you're in the UK. Did you see it?
Yes, I did see this report, but they made a mistake. It should have said 42 days because the assumption is that you go into your bunker and you come out after the general election. That would have made some sense. Unfortunately, I suspect that's not what they meant. This is nudge politics. This is that point you've just absolutely rightly made. It's the politics of fear. Some ominous spectre is coming to get us, and we better be ready. But don't worry, we, the great vanilla sky politicians, will save you. Never mind the fact they've caused the problems from terms of the wars and this balmy, non-existent climate crisis and everything else. They've caused the problems, and now they want us to trust them to fix it. This is a piece of piffle, to be honest with you. And let's remember, we live in a society now where the supermarkets have a just-in-time policy. If they don't get deliveries in 2 days, then the shelves become empty. Let's just start being realistic. This is nonsense.
The problem as well, isn't it? It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. As soon as you tell people, you're going to run out of toilet paper, everybody builds these toilet paper mountains, don't they? And that's the sort of reality of these sort of things. So be careful, but be careful about fear. They're saying it's just in case of power cuts and things like that. But it's a bit of a scary announcement. Do you have such a thing in Croatia, that wonderful Opatia? Have they warned you to stock up on stuff just in case?
No, they haven't, and especially not to stock up for 2 days or 3 days. I mean, that's absolutely patently ridiculous. But I do remember when I grew up in the communist world, which began to implode in the late 80s and came apart in 1991. And one of the things that vanishes during the crisis is the toilet paper, and it's not by accident. That one item is absolutely essential to demoralize a population. Toilet paper. But then the things that will also vanish will be coffee, sugar, chocolate, toothpaste, cooking oil, things like this. I think that people, if they want to feel a little bit insulated from a big crisis like that, they should probably have at least 2 months worth of reserve. They should make a list of things that are non-perishable goods that have a long shelf life, and gradually start building up a pantry of food that can serve them for at least 2 months. After that period, there's going to be aid and other solutions will come up, but 3 days is just an insult.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, if people haven't seen it, I don't want to scaremonger, but do go to this government website. It does say, how would you prepare for an emergency? And they talk about specifically flooding, fires and power cuts, which could affect us all. Check it out. Read it for yourself. Don't be scared. Don't rush and buy lots of toilet paper, as Alex says, but have a look and make up your own mind. And let us know. Let us know here on today's News Talk TNT. Let me finally ask one question then. If Labour do win, and it is an if, remember people dismissed Donald Trump the first time around against Hillary and woke up in the morning assuming Hillary had won, woke up and here's Donald. Don't assume anything, but basically if they do win, how do you think it's going to affect our standing on the world stage? Lebed, I'll let you go first this time.
A diminished status. My opinion is not because I hate the Labour Party. I'm not keen on party politics generally, but it's because I don't think Starmer's really up to the job. I could be proved wrong, but when you saw Tony Blair in that job, who happened to be Labour, he stood tall in the world. I didn't agree with many of the things he did, but he was a statesman. And the relationship between him and Bill Clinton was comparable to the relationship between Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. That was a very positive axis for those who thought UK should be very strong. I don't see Starmer in that light. He had the chance to pull Boris Johnson down time and time again, and he just couldn't deliver the final sucker punch. So I don't think we're helped by that. Now, I think of Rishi Sunak as a nice man, but a middle manager. But I think Starmer will be weaker. And as we've said before, he will do roughly the same thing, as Alex said, about international foreign policy. And that's what the outside world sees. No change.
Interesting. What do you think, Alex? Do you think if it were to be Starmer, do you think he would gain respect on the world stage?
No, absolutely not. I would completely agree with Lambit. Starmer's shenanigans and corruption is well known and well understood in the world. The Labour Party coup against Jeremy Corbyn was noticed, and I think that it will only be another piece of evidence corroborating the idea that the United Kingdom is not really a democracy, that it's a stage managed oligarchy with those two cheeks of the same back end parading one way and then the other way to string the people along to thinking like things are unbearable, now we're going to vote this way, things are horrible, now we're going to vote that way, rather than staging a revolution and changing the whole system altogether, which I think is due for an overhaul.
Yeah, amazing stuff. Well, time has flown by. I think we should pay George Galloway his royalties for his glorious turn of phrase, and he got many. He'll be very grateful. Nice hats as well. We'd like to see George. Thank you for all of your comments this week. It's been the first week here on the Muckrakers. You have been a brilliant part. We've had some fantastic calls throughout the week. Do follow me at Andrew Eborn, and do follow TNT Live as well on Twitter. We like all those messages. We love to hear from you. I'll be back with you next week, same time, 12 o'clock in London, about 7 a.m. in Philadelphia, if you remember that. But around the world, it's time for the Muckrakers. I think that was the start of Live Aid. That's when I sort of worked on that sort of basis. I'll see you next time. Have a great holiday weekend. See you on Monday. Take care. Thank you, gentlemen. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.